39 of Two Kevins with Grace and Steele. I'm Kevin Steele.
And I'm Kevin Michael Grace.
We begin this show with a guest, Professor Paul Gottfried. He is one of the leading scholars of American conservatism and is author of several works on political history and theory, including Leo Strauss and the Conservative Movement in America, published in 2013, and The Strange Death of Marxism, the European Left in the New Millennium, 2005. His most recent book, Fascism, The Career of a Concept, was published by Northern Illinois University Press and came out this February. His essays appear in numerous anthologies. Gottfried is Professor Emeritus at Elizabethtown College in Pennsylvania and is the president of the H.L. Mencken Club. He writes for Unz.com, VDare, and LouRockwell.com. He spoke with Kevin Grace by phone last week.
So, Professor, it's good to be with you here today.
Mm-hmm.
I thought that I would begin with a quotation from George Orwell's 1948 essay, Politics and the English Language. Quote, "The word fascism now has no meaning except insofar as it signifies something not desirable." Now, this essay by Orwell is one of the most famous and influential written in the English language. It is an essay which millions of college students have read as part of a course requirement. And yet Orwell's warning against this misuse of language has been ignored. One can say it's been trampled on. And you have dealt with this very subject in your most recent book, published by Northern Illinois University Press last year, called Fascism, The Career of a Concept. And I thought we could begin with you talking a little bit about Jonah Goldberg's book on the subject, Liberal Fascism, which ignored the warning of Orwell, and he simply accumulated a bunch of things that were going on in the West that he didn't like and labeled it fascism.
Right. I'd like to begin by saying that I really don't think that anybody considers fascism to be a movement, a bad movement of the left, unless we're describing a Habsburg monarchist or an early 20th century pope. Almost everybody...
Well, sorry to interrupt. I was just going to say that I might be one of those people because I was greatly influenced by the writings of Erich von Kuehnelt-Leddihn, and he very much regarded fascism as a leftist movement.
Right. No, I don't accept his argument, except within the context of a 19th century conservative worldview. And I respect his classical conservatism, but I think that most people who are attacking fascism today and who have been attacking it since the 1930s see it as a movement of the left. And this, I would not really... rather of a right, and I would not exclude Jonah Goldberg from that category. He simply uses the argument that the Democrats are really fascist, or people who favor the welfare state are fascist, just as a way of smearing them. He does not really make any kind of substantive argument in his book. And then what he does, of course, is try to show that the adoption of affirmative action programs are really like Hitler's persecution of Jews and Slavs, that it excludes certain people, and therefore, it's an evil thing, but it's basically an evil thing of the right. I don't have the impression he really sees fascism as a movement of the left. He's simply trying to tar the opposition party. And of course, the argument that, fascism is a movement of the counter-revolutionary right is one that I make in my book. And in this sense, I am influenced by the Marxists of the 1930s and 1920s and 1930s who saw in Italian fascism and Latin fascism generally a movement that was organized to look like a revolutionary movement, but which was in fact a movement of counter-revolutionaries who were just imitating the tactics and rhetoric of the left by making what they call the National Revolution, but whose real purpose, of course, according to the Marxist argument, was to suppress revolutionary socialism. And that is, in fact, the function that fascism served in Italy after the First World War. As a movement, it was locked in mortal combat with the revolutionary left. And the socialism which it preached, or the welfare stateism that the fascists preached, I would argue was always a kind of window decoration. There were, of course, real revolutionary socialists within the fascist movement, but they were usually shut up or, given subordinate positions in the movement in which they couldn't be very dangerous. So I do end up buying the argument that fascism is a movement of the right. But I also make the argument that it is a movement that has absolutely nothing to do with the present time. It is an interwar movement in which there is a civil war going on between right and left, very often fought out between World War I veterans. And fascism is characteristic of Second World Latin countries at a particular time in history. I also argue that Nazism is not generic fascism. It is very different. It is much more violent, much more imperialistic, and it is genocidal, which fascism was not. And how
about Franco's regime?
Well, Franco's regime is not a fascist regime. I mean, he does take over some of the trappings of the Phalange, which is in fact a very typical Latin fascist movement. But what he does at the same time is he marginalizes the Phalange. Once he adopts its symbols, but he puts dangerous phalangists out of the way. And if you look at Franco's government, it's basically a kind of military dictatorship of the right, which is a caretaker government, which finally yields to a constitutional monarchy, which becomes, over the years, a kind of cultural Marxist leftist government. But Franco, in my opinion, is not a real fascist. He just opportunistically takes over some of the trappings of the Phalange, but then throws them away when they're no longer necessary.
Well, my reading of history is that Franco saw the situation after the successful conclusion of the Civil War.
Right.
And these phalangists had been loyal fighters, so one didn't want to turn on them. On the other hand, one didn't want to take their dictums seriously.
Exactly. In the case of Salazar, you do find, in Portugal, something like clerical fascism, which also gains a certain currency in Austria in the 1930s. I don't consider clerical fascists to be real fascists. They were essentially conservative Catholic clericalists who take over some of the corporatist trappings of fascism, which fascism, of course, in turn borrowed from sort of neo-medieval Catholic economics and social organization. Fascism really does seem to be very much rooted in Latin Catholic culture, even though most of the fascists are not devout Catholics, but they do imbibe the cultural trappings and some of the social teachings of the Church. And
well, in our last podcast, we had a consideration of Hilaire Belloc's 1912 treatise, The Servile State,
right,
which is a book which greatly impressed me when I first read it almost 40 years ago, and greatly impressed me again when I just reread it. And I wondered to what extent the distributism that Belloc and Chesterton advocated would be mirrored in any fascist regime that we have seen.
No, I really don't think it does. I mean, what you see in Belloc is, a defense of small property holders, or something like subsidiarity, a Catholic teaching of subsidiarity. What the fascists do is create this grandiose structure, going all the way from the top of the government to the bottom of the economy, in which everybody is placed into some kind of corporate group. A lot of it is simple, as I said, it's sort of window dressing. It's a kind of scaffolding, which really doesn't affect the economic functioning of the country very much. So again, it's sort of a kind of window dressing. I think Belloc has a much more serious economic idea. It is one that may not be entirely workable, but is at least a model that I can take seriously. And somebody like Christopher Lasch, who was a lapsed Presbyterian, was very much impressed by Belloc and Chesterton's writings on distributism.
How many regimes that we have seen in the world would you characterize as actual fascist regimes?
Well, there's only one regime that's sort of paradigmatic, and it is in a sense the perfect or the near perfect, historically closest approximation to the fascism, and that's Italy. I can't think of any other countries in which the fascists really take power. They do not take power in Spain, because if you remember, the Falange is locked in the Civil War, and most of its leaders get wiped out by the Republican side, and then Franco tries to tame and use it, at the end of the war. There are fascists in France. They're Latin fascists, but they don't go very far. You do have fascists in Hungary, where the leader of the fascist party was a Calvinist, but he admired Catholic corporate teachings, a man named Gömbös, and he's brought to power in 1936. But that's not the same government as the one the Germans installed in 1944 under Salaschi, which is a really murderous government, but they're not really fascists. They're just nutcases who work for the Germans. The Iron Guard does have some fascist elements in Romania, but they never really come to power, right? And they just murder a lot of people, and then they're murdered in turn by the government. So Italy is about the closest what one can come to seeing, fascism as a regime, not simply as an idea, as a movement.
Let's assume, for the sake of argument, I've long been fascinated my reading of Louis Ferdinand Céline,
right,
and the Vichy government in its final stages. You see these French intellectuals who had been associated with the left, with socialism,
right.
And until it was clear that Hitler was on the outs, they seemed to be undergoing, how would you say, a change in their political thinking. That this new thing seems to be the way where history is going, and we better get on side.
Right. Yeah, well, this is true in the case of the Vichy government, which seems to be a combination of a lot of strange elements in French politics. You do have vicious anti-Semites, the people who volunteer for the cagoulards, the one who run around rounding up or killing Jews and other undesirables in terms of Nazi policy. Then you have Catholic corporatists, but I think the dominant element are the ones who believe in what's called planisme. They're the planificateurs. They're the ones who just want to reorganize the economy, and they sort of get their start in the Vichy regime. Again, I don't think the Vichy regime is a fascist regime. It is a collaborationist occupation regime. And like, the great scholar of fascism, Stanley Payne, I do make the distinction between those who collaborate with the Nazi occupation and those who are theoretical fascists. And they're not the same necessarily. They usually are not the same at all.
If we're talking about fascism, true fascism, to what extent is it, by its nature, racially anti-Semitic?
Yeah, it's interesting that when there was a conference held in Montreux in 1934, organized by the Italian fascists, the subject of it was a fascist international. The subject of anti-Semitism came up, and the Germans would not attend because they were like real anti-Semites. The clerical fascists wouldn't attend because they didn't really think of themselves as fascists. They were simply conservative clericalists. Okay, but among the people who attended, the only ones who seemed to be really violent anti-Semites were the Iron Guard from Romania, and they wanted to make the international Jewish danger a major issue, and the Italians at the time didn't care because Mussolini was allied with Zionists and was opposing Nazi Germany, so he didn't, he had Jews in the fascist movement, and they were among the leaders, so he didn't want to bring this stuff up. He does change sides, of course, we know, by 1938. And the other fascists, the Spanish, they couldn't care less.
Now, you've read Ian Kershaw's biography of Hitler.
Which biography?
He wrote a 2-volume biography of Hitler.
Oh, yes, I did. Right.
Well, I have to say that I was astonished that in this book he does not seem to know the difference or care about the difference between religious and racial anti-Semitism.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Does that surprise you?
No, not at all. I mean, sort of given the ideological position or the cultural position from which most academics come, I'm not surprised at all.
I just thought that, this book was heralded as, a great addition to what we know about Hitler, and I got about 150 pages into it, and I thought he's making these elementary mistakes. The one I just mentioned, he goes on and on about the Nazi Party being so strong in the 1920s in Bavaria.
It was not.
As if this is, well, no, as if this is, significant. And I'm thinking, well, the headquarters were in Munich, so that might have something to do with early popularity there. But later on, of course, it was in the Protestant areas of Germany
right, exactly,
where the Nazi Party was the strongest. And have we moved so far from that time, or has historical consciousness become so attenuated that one simply expects this sort of thing from historians now?
Yeah, what has happened is that we simply fit all historical narratives to particular superstitions or prejudices. I wrote an essay, which is going to be my new anthology, about a book on Pius XI and Mussolini. And if you read this book, you get the impression that the Lateran Pact or Lateran Agreements of 1929 ushered in the Holocaust. And this man won a prize of a teacher at Brown, and then he was invited to speak to the Italian Senate to make them feel guilty about this. And I'm looking at this, and there's nothing Pius XI did that was wrong. He simply tried to make peace with the Italian government in 1929. Now, I point out this man does not criticize the fact that the papacy has diplomatic relations with all kinds of anti-Catholic leftist governments that have dictatorships, that kill Christians. That's okay. But the Italian government in 1929 was an eminently civilized government. They had hardly any, as far as I know, no political prisoners in jail. They were willing to tolerate religious dissenters. They probably treated religious Jews better than religious Catholics up until the Lateran agreements. But there was absolutely nothing I can find that was wrong about the decision of the papacy to make those agreements, which gave them a certain amount of power over the spiritual life of Italian citizens and so forth. But anything that is associated with fascism, Italian or any fascism, or anything associated with the church at that point is considered evil, whereas anything associated with the left is good. I once wrote a piece saying that the people who would be absolutely acceptable saints from the standpoint of the political, cultural left would be the Rosenbergs, because they were Jewish communists or something. I mean, obviously you have to be on the left and have to be politically correct to be good. Now, this nonsense that somehow Bavaria is fundamental to the Nazi takeover is absolute nonsense. There were only 22% of, I think it was even less than that, of German Catholics who voted for the Nazis. Their votes came overwhelmingly from Protestants and typically from unchurched or non-church Protestants. They had very little Catholic support, and to try to blame Nazism on the Catholic Church is ridiculous.
Well, of course, famously, Pope Pius XI issued an encyclical, Mit Brennen der Sorge, which was the first papal encyclical written in German, which he ordered to be read in all the German Catholic churches on Palm Sunday, where he made it very clear that he had no time whatsoever for Nazi ideology, that he considered it abhorrent.
It was also written by Hitler's Pope, Pius XII, supposed to be Hitler's Pope, which of course he wasn't in any way. And Pius XII was extremely critical of the Nazis, and so was Pius XI. In November of I think it was October or November of 1938, when the fascist government stripped Jews, the right to attend universities and other things like that. After allowing, of course, Jews to join the fascist party and treating them rather well for the first 16 or 18 years of the fascist regime, Pius XI was extremely indignant. Now, the Church says, well, he made anti-Jewish remarks. Well, that's quite possible, but he thought that this was, that this was outrageous to strip these people of their citizenship. And, there's nothing to suggest that the Vatican supported Nazi anti-Semitism or anything of the kind. There's obviously evidence of Catholic anti-Semitism. You can find it throughout history, but their record in the Nazi period is better than anyone else's, And the papacy it shows absolutely no sympathy for the Nazi government or for racial anti-Semitism. It denounces racial anti-Semitism.
I wanted to bring you to the present
Yeah.
with discussion of the so-called alt-right.
Mm-hmm.
And as I mentioned to you when we spoke earlier, I wanted to nominate you for the position of godfather of the alt-right for the following reason. That your position towards our enemies, the neoconservatives and so-called movement conservative, has been fierce and uncompromising, whereas the establishment conservatism's position towards its enemy has been, oh, please don't be angry with us. We really mean well, and if you would stop, maybe slow down wrecking civilization, that would be good.
Mm-hmm.
And I wondered what your view of the alt-right was.
Well, you got me to thinking about this from our earlier conversation, and I think I've probably influenced the alt-right without being part of it in several different ways, one of which, of course, is my view that the conservative movement is so contaminated by the neoconservative influence, and since the neoconservatives' takeover of and more recently by the takeover, the unopposed takeover by the Republican establishment, that in order to have a serious right-wing opposition to the left, we need an entirely new right. And of course, the alt-right has taken this view seriously, and they share my loathing for the neoconservatives. Another way I may have influenced them is all that I've written on the European right-wing intellectuals, who interest me a great deal, and I've been writing on that subject for the last 30 or 40 years. And my writings on people like Carl Schmitt and some of the Italian fascists and French right-wing intellectuals, those writings have been read, and particularly by people who are now associated with the alt-right. And my essays are anthologized by Arctos Press, which, for want of a better publisher, is the press of the alt-right. Finally, I think the argument that I've made that communism and fascism belong to the interwar period, and they fought a civil war. It's now Europe was divided by the Civil War, which is the argument of Ernst Nolte, which I accept, and that war is now over, and neither fascism nor communism has any relevance for us anymore, and we face a different enemy, which is cultural Marxism, which is allied to the modern democratic administrative state. This, too, seems to be an argument that everybody on the alt-right is echoing. Where I do not agree with them is in the white nationalism. I think this is ridiculous. I don't even know what white nationalism means.
Well, I would have to interrupt to say that I don't know that white nationalism is actually central to the alt-right. I mean, you have a lot of different voices, and of course, as you know, when you have marginalized people, a great many of them will adopt marginal positions.
Yes.
Which is what's happened here.
Mm-hmm.
Are you familiar with the alt-right people on Twitter and the sort of thing that they engage in?
I don't see them on Twitter. I do read them occasionally on VDare. Then they have their own website, and I know Richard Spencer and Jared Taylor both quite well. They're central figures in the alt-right movement.
There is, among the alt-right, a great deal of comedy that is had from fascism, the use of this word fasci, for instance, and having fun with Hitler and the use of, 1488 or just 88.
Right.
And I suppose I'm old enough that I find this quite disturbing, but I wonder to what extent this is simply a generation which is young enough and so far removed from the events of 1939 to 1945 that it is fed up with older generations telling them, no, this is the most important thing and perhaps perhaps the only important thing that ever happened in world history.
Right. No, I think you're right. I think there's also a general irreverence for the decencies or the moral standards of civilization. I mean, they're not bounded by traditional Christian beliefs. They sort of invent their morality, a kind of almost parody of Nietzschean morality or of Nietzsche's aristocratic morality. there isn't very much of a positive nature that seems to be holding this thing up. And what bothers me the most is they don't have a sense of proportion. This is what I see, by the way, in someone like Donald Trump, who I am supporting for president for want of an alternative. But, there's a total lack of prudence, a sense of measure in this alt-right. And this concerns me. This is something that preoccupies me, because if they ever wish to have any kind of power, they're going to have to act in more responsible fashion. Finally, I don't think they're going to get any power. I think that they do absolutely nothing to break the left and the neoconservative, which is part of the left, to break their hold on the media. It's just going to continue. And just by being irreverent or by, treating Hitler as sort of some kind of funny figure, they're not going to make any kind of inroads in the establishment. They're not going to take it over.
I'm not so sure about that, because it seems to me we see the growth of an alternative establishment. Right-wing sites like Breitbart, for instance. You probably had a similar experience. I started reading National Review in 1969 when I was 14 years old. Mm-hmm. And it went through a dire period in the 1980s.
Right.
And then O'Sullivan and Brimelow came on, and it became exciting again, and then they got fired. And it got to the point, I'd say roughly 20 years ago, where I just decided there is nothing in this magazine that I find interesting in the slightest.
Yeah. I probably became disgusted with it a lot earlier, going back to the late 80s. When I was a frequent contributor, then I was thrown out, believe it or not, by John O'Sullivan. But then O'Sullivan turned to the right again, and he embraced Brimelow. But, I was no longer on board by then.
Well, going back to the alt-right, I see, as I told you earlier, my analogy of the conservative movement is on the night of the Indiana primary, these people set themselves on fire and then tossed themselves over a cliff.
Right.
You better not select Trump, or we're going to do something terrible.
Right.
And then they did it, and America yawned. And it seems to me that the conservative movement is kaput.
I don't think it's kaput at all. I think that, these are the people who continue to control Fox News, who are the people to go to within the Murdoch media, and they're going to stay in those positions. By the way, this is not the first time the neoconservatives bet on the wrong horse. They've done this before. In 1976, they supported Ford over Reagan, yet when Reagan came to power in 1980, they took over his administration. They have so much power, so much influence, so much money behind them that there's no way that they're going to be replaced.
Well, I would. Sorry to interrupt. I would argue that it was obvious of the neoconservatives from the beginning that they never had a political base.
No,
the conservative movement has so much alienated its political base that I don't believe the conservative movement has a political base anymore, except perhaps, in the prairie part of the United States where Ted Cruz did so well.
Yeah.
That you see how Trump swept Appalachia, how he swept the so-called liberal eastern states.
Right.
And I just see that there is a tremendous vacuum there.
Well, what I would see is a kind of disconnect, that there's something called the conservative movement, which will continue to be dominated by neoconservatives, who will run National Review, Weekly Standard, who will be the predominant voice on Fox News. These people, Wall Street Journal, they entirely control. But this will go on and on. But the base of the right is different. The base of the right is the white working class in the United States, just as it is the indigenous white working class in France, in Austria, in other countries where the right seems to be organizing effectively right now. And this right that we see in the United States, which is a white working class right, has nothing to do with the conservative movement. Or that is to say, the movement that we see in the media, which tries to relate to it, but does so in a very awkward fashion, and is being basically subsidized by transnational capital.
Sure. But you see throughout the primary campaign that the conservative movement had a supposed kill shot against Trump, which was he's not a conservative.
Mm-hmm.
And the more that they yelled that he was not a conservative, the more popular Trump became.
That's correct.
Because I don't see, my own view is that conservatism was made completely redundant by the fall of the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc, that it was an accommodationist position which had served its purpose, and as Pat Buchanan and as many others argued at the time, now we move on to something else, but they were not willing to move on to something else.
But they were also occupied in the 1980s by the neoconservatives who pushed them to the left on all domestic issues. You know, the conservative movement was not as conservative by 1990 as it had been in 1960 or even 1970. At least the part of the conservative movement, the visible part, the media part of the conservative movement, you know, by then they had embraced, by 1990 they had embraced Martin Luther King as a great conservative Christian theologian. You have the Abraham Lincoln worship, the influence of Harry Jaffa.
The hatred of Generalissimo Franco.
Right.
Even culturally, with John Ford's The Searchers. Oh, this is a terrible racist movie,
right,
which
exactly.
all right-thinking people must reject.
Yeah. No, I mean, so the conservative movement had moved toward the left in many ways by 1990. Finally, as I've argued in some of my writings, the conservative movement, which leads the campaign against Soviet communism, does it from the left. It is to the left of the communist movement by 1990. You know, what does it object to? That they're not large enough labor movements in Russia, that, you know, that they oppress minorities, that they're Russian nationalists, that they're anti-Semites. These are the arguments that are coming out of the conservative movement. Whereas, you know, in 1960, they were very happy to embrace Francisco Franco, you know, as a great Christian warrior against atheistic communism. So the conservative movement travels very far to the left by 1990. And, you know, it's not just that the Soviet Union or the Soviet bloc collapses that you would say sort of makes it redundant. It is the fact that it is no longer conservative, which I think has to be kept in mind. It has become simply part of the left by 1990.
Well, what do you make of this thing that happened where conservatism was traditionally associated with throne and altar?
Mm-hmm.
And then you have this fusionism idea of Frank Meyer.
Yeah.
And by the 1980s, certainly by the 1990s, pretty much all conservatives were openly worshiping at the shrine of Manchester liberalism. Mm-hmm. James Goldsmith famously said that the economy is to serve us. We are not there to serve the economy. Right. But the conservatives said exactly the opposite. Why and how do you think this came about?
Well, I think that was always a strain in the conservative movement. It was one among other strains. The support of a free market economy, the defense of free trade. And this becomes very important in the 1980s because, you know, Ronald Reagan does nothing to dismantle the welfare state. In fact, he expands the size of government. What he does do, however, is begin to negotiate free trade treaties, talk about, you know, democratic capitalism, which has always struck me as a kind of almost an oxymoron. But at the same time that we're sort of moving towards social democracy or a larger welfare state, there's talk about capitalism or Manchester. This is very popular in England, particularly, you know, with the Thatcher and the Thatcherites. Although Thatcher does not really, you know, return England to a 19th century Manchesterian economy, but there's a lot of talk about the value of free enterprise. The Mont Pelerin Society pushes this. But I think a lot of it, and you also have these deregulation plans that are set into operation. But it doesn't change the structure of the state at all.
Well, I see Margaret Thatcher as being motivated primarily by a hatred of old Toryism.
Well, she doesn't really like the old Tories either. But, you know, she is a kind of classical liberal in the 19th century sense. But she really does nothing to bring about a classical liberal society in England. Because she manages to denationalize some things. She stands up to some communist-controlled mass worker unions. But, you know, these countries remain welfare states. They remain large administration. They remain that under Reagan, and they remain that under Thatcher.
Now, here's something else you've written about. This astonishing pivot of the left that we're about socialism. Oh, well, no one likes socialism anymore, so we're about multiculturalism and diversity.
Right.
And it's as if, oh, okay, fine, that's what you're in favor of, and so, yeah, we'll just forget about the socialism business, and we'll let you people keep running things.
Yeah, that's exactly what happens. But I think what the left comes to recognize is that whatever mix of welfare state, democracy, and capitalism exists, it seems to be doing well, and the leftists themselves are making money through the system, and they don't want to change it very much. But what they do want is cultural social transformation. And what they do is sort of a move from Marxism or sort of diluted Marxism into cultural Marxism. And cultural Marxism becomes the dominant ideologies of Western democracy, so that today one reads in National Review that Putin is a vicious bigot because he does not have gay marriage. Or somebody writing a National Review online that we've abandoned the Ukrainians together with the Ukrainians transgendered. Presumably gay marriage is now a conservative position because Jonah Goldberg, John Podhoretz, and other recognized leaders of the conservative movement fully accept it. So,
going back to the deformation of conservatism, the highest value of the so-called conservatives is choice. They have no understanding or love for the good life. Whatever people want to do, that is the highest value. And, all of the slippery slope predictions made from the late 60s have come true. And the attitude of the conservatives has become, well, just tell us how you are going to further wreck society and give us about 5 to 10 years and we'll get on board with that.
Right, but it's not really choice. I mean, there's some things which they really don't care about, like gay marriage. So, well, you can have a choice there. If it comes to Israeli security, any number of other issues, military, fighting for democracy somewhere, they're not going to give those positions up. There's not going to be any choice there. It's only, or certain free trade agreements that benefit their donor base. They're not going to give that up. But other moral, social issues, there can be choice because they don't really care about them. They're up there for grabs.
But if the conservative movement no longer stands for the good life, then what reason would it have to exist? Because you have the left, which advocates for more and more and greater freedom, even things which are, preposterous like gay marriage and transgenderism. They're carrying the water. Why do we need a right to follow in their way?
Well, we need it because all parliamentary democracies are supposedly based on a dialectic between right and left. However we want to define those terms. I mean, I have an essay in my new anthology called Litmus Test Conservatism. And litmus test conservatism means conservative is whatever Fox News and the Republican Party tell you is conservative. There's nothing intrinsically conservative about this. But, we, for instance, believing that, we're not to have ecology, but, all forest land is to be sold to people, put up whatever they want. That is a conservative position. Well, I mean, maybe why isn't ecology a conservative position? And you go on and on. Or why is fighting wars all over the globe to spread human rights and democracy a conservative? I mean, that to me sounds like Jacobinism or Bolshevism or something like that. But the answer is because the Republican Party and its donor base tell you it's a conservative position, and they run the magazines and the rest of the media, which are identified with conservatism. So these words have no intrinsic meaning anymore, these political designations or lines of demarcation. And, I remember once Teddy Kennedy was saying, the United States should really mind its own business, only use military things if our national interest requires it. It was explained to me that this is a very leftist position. Well, I happen to agree with that position, and I'm certainly not a leftist, but, in terms of this what I call litmus test conservatism or liberalism, Party A, which is supposed to be the leftist party, takes that position. So, it's simply the dialectic, the required dialectic, within a democracy presupposes something called the right and something called the left. So that's why we have right and left. And then you also get people on board who identify themselves with, the red versus the blue. I think Richard Spencer once said that, this is like rooting for a baseball or a football team. I'm for the Reds, I'm for the Blues or something, and the red means I don't know why red means conservative and blue means liberal. Historically, blue is the color of the right. Right?
Well, of course, that was just a mistake that someone at CNN made, and,
right.
Well, if CNN decides it, we all have to follow it. But going back to the conservative movement, it decided, and Fox News decided, and its various organs decided, that in 2016, the Republicans would nominate a Hispanic presidential candidate, either Hispanic by birth, such as Cruz or Rubio, or Hispanic by adoption, like Jeb Bush.
Right.
And the Republican Party voters said, no, we're not going to have that. Isn't that encouraging?
It is encouraging, particularly when you think that a lot of the people who said no were white-collar, or rather blue-collar Democrats, who came over to Trump. And that I find, a very encouraging sign. If I had my druthers, I'd like to see the right as a white working class movement, although some blacks want to join, if they identify themselves as workers or Americans, whatever, it's okay. But, it is going to be a white working class movement, and that's fine with me. And
well, you knew Nixon. And
yes.
Nixon, along with Kevin Phillips and Pat Buchanan, came up with this idea of a realignment
right.
of the Republican Party. Why did that fail?
Well, the realignment did not entirely fail. I mean, there were two notions of realignment. One that you get with Kevin Phillips, whom I know, and the other notion of realignment is one which is, more along ideological lines. But you do have a realignment, and this is part of Phillips' emerging Republican majority. It's part of his argument. It's geographical. It's a sectional realignment that the South and the West will become the backbone of a Republican Party, which will be a conservative party. And Northeast, which had originally been Republican, other parts of the country would go into the Democratic column, but more of the country would be Republican. So it was seen largely in terms of geography. But then you have this notion of a silent majority, right? Or Sam Francis's and Donald Warren's notion of Middle American radicalism, which comes along later. So it is not only a sectional realignment, it is going to be an ideological and a social realignment. And what happens is the social ideological realignment doesn't really fully take place. The geographical realignment does take place up to a degree, although there are areas in the West, of course, which are quite far to the left politically, most of the West Coast. And, there are areas in the East which might well go back into the conservative column, but generally there has been a geographical alignment. The social realignment occurs, for example, in 1980 when you get working-class Democrats voting for Reagan. I think the social realignment is going to take place it's taking place even more dramatically with Donald Trump.
If you look at there's a blogger called Face to Face or Akinokure who has pointed out that if you look at the racial breakdown of the Republican primary race, that the support for Cruz, when it was down to, Cruz and Kasich versus Trump, the support for Cruz and Kasich came overwhelmingly from American voters of English, German, and Scandinavian descent, whereas the support for Trump came overwhelmingly from voters of Irish, Scots-Irish, Italian, and Slavic descent. What do you make of that?
That's interesting because Trump is himself, a German Scot, a Presbyterian. Yet if you listen to him speak, he sounds exactly like an Italian, New Yorker. You think of him as a Catholic ethnic, but that has nothing to do with his real background. But he does not really fit into his background.
But I mean, he comes from Queens. He is of Queens, and he isn't one of those people who's decided that this is embarrassing detritus, which I must leave behind.
Right.
He's a man who's rooted in place.
Well, I wonder, because his parents were very proper upper-class WASP. He's not. He's very different from his father. But he obviously connects quite easily with this Slavic or Irish or Italian ethnic base.
Now, going back to Rupert Murdoch, he's a man with an eye for the main chance, as they say. And he famously or notoriously ordered his newspapers, The Times, and most importantly, The Sun, which was the voice of the white working class in Britain, to support Tony Blair and New Labour.
Right.
So doesn't it make sense to you that he's a businessman who wants to augment his wealth, that if he sees Donald Trump being the likely nominee or likely winner, that he simply gets behind it?
Yeah, there seem to be two issues that really matter to Murdoch. One of them is Israel. He's an absolutely ardent Zionist. And the other thing is America getting involved throughout the world to spread our notion of human rights and democracy. And he is an uncompromising neoconservative in foreign policy. On domestic issues, he's basically a Hillary Clinton Democrat. He supported Hillary Clinton in the past. He supported her for Senate, and then he supported her for the presidency. He's not a conservative of any kind. Yet he runs the media, or pays for the media of Conservatism Incorporated. I don't think he's entirely hostile to Trump, because I think he views Trump as a social liberal like himself, who can be counted on to support Israel, even if Trump is not entirely reliable in other foreign policy commitments. So, I mean, I could see him doing this. I was surprised in the case of Trump how quickly Giuliani, Newt Gingrich, Chris Christie, all of whom I associated with, sort of the Eastern liberal wing of the Republican Party, except for Gingrich, who, started out as a neocon darling. I was amazed by how quickly they came over to Trump.
Well, especially Giuliani, who was being touted, as a former Republican candidate on the basis of, you'll love this guy because he wants to blow up the whole world.
That's correct. And
now, I wanted to ask you about the Jews and Trump, because I'm not the only one to be mystified by this Donald Trump derangement syndrome that we see amongst a great many prominent Jews. Now, we know that Donald Trump is a friend of Israel. We know that some of his grandchildren are Jews. And, to put it, to make it short, that he is a friend of the Jews and Israel. And yet, we see this ferocious opposition to him, which we saw previously with Pat Buchanan's presidential campaigns. To what do you ascribe this to?
Well, the fact that American Jews are overwhelmingly allied to the left. And Trump, because of his position on immigration, and because he uses the word America First, which is associated with those who are opposed to America's entry into World War II, he is simply seen as a dangerous figure. You have to remember that, about 80% or more of American Jews voted for Obama. The first time it was he got 82%, and the second time he was somewhat less, but he won the vast majority of American Jews. Jews are on the left in this country, and the ones who are on the right, in quotation, are neocons. So, I mean, there's no reason these people would be on the side of Trump. On the other hand, he seems to be surrounded by Jews. I mean, the people who speak up for him, his managers, people he works with are all Jews, except Lewandowski, who I think is Catholic, but most of them are Jews. And, I mean, the charge that he's anti-Semitic is total. I don't know how people could even say that. There was a heated argument. I thought it was nonsense, but it sort of shows, the way the Jews are divided. Some of them in the Republican camp are divided on Trump. David Horowitz came out strongly for Trump because he's good for Israel. And he attacked Bill Kristol, who's anti-Trump, on the grounds that Kristol is helping Hillary to win the election and she's anti-Israeli. Now, the argument is entirely on which one is better for Israel, but, it is clear that, that Horowitz sees the Trump's election as essential for Israeli security.
Well, I joked a couple of weeks ago that the so-called renegade Jew phenomenon is two bald men fighting over a comb.
Mm-hmm. Right.
But so could this be a question? I remember Richard Ingram's, the English author and editor, relating that many years ago, A.J.P. Taylor had told him to the effect that, young man, my advice to you is to always stay out of the middle of Jewish quarrels. Do you think that this is what this is about, that it really isn't so much about Trump? Is it two different groups of Jews having at it?
It could be that. I think in the case of Crystal, it's simply a power play that he and his people entirely control the conservative movement, the Republican Party, and now they're losing their grip, and they're very, very upset. I mean, they only have 99%. I don't think they're going to fall apart. They're just not going to have as much power as they had before. And he's going to punish the Republican Party by electing Hillary Clinton. And his friend and former book collaborator, Robert Kagan, is already in Hillary's camp because he's, accusing Trump of being a fascist. He's saving us from fascism by allying with Hillary. In the case of Horowitz, he is an intense, fanatical Zionist. So, I would expect him to do that. I think the very intense Zionists are lined up behind Trump. The more liberal Jews and the neocons are on the other side.
Well, William Crystal is showing signs of derangement with his claims that he goes out in public and people recognize him and they shout out, "Never Trump" or "Renegade Jew" or whatever. Have you noticed this?
Yeah, he does seem to have illusions of grandeur, but he's had so much power on the basis of so little intelligence up until now that one can understand why he continues to be trapped in this illusion or this sense of grandeur, unjust illusion, this illusion of grandeur. But he really has had tremendous influence and power on the basis of having done nothing, and he thinks that this will probably continue. But he's also afraid that, he's sort of losing his grip. And, he has all these emissaries like Stephen Hayes, whom I see on Fox News, who's violently denouncing Trump. He does have these allies, but I also think he is driven by a sense of self-importance.
Well, you look at Bill Kristol and you look at John Podhoretz, and their fathers were very bright. Podhoretz Jr. blocked me on Twitter after I joked that he is the place where regression meets mean.
Yeah,
this idea of every cause becoming a racket. You see this very much in play with the neocons, right?
Right. But then they have inexhaustible money, and inexhaustible access to the media. I don't think one can really play this down. It's sort of like saying the United States is going to collapse in the next, year. We have so much money, this is not going to happen. We're the richest country that's ever existed. And the neocons have so much power, so much money, so much media access that I don't see them going away, even if Donald Trump is elected president.
Well, what do you think of the idea that, let's say there's been no recovery from 2008. Mm-hmm. That's obvious.
Yeah.
The Fed keeps helicoptering money to the banks, and it's not trickling down, and the situation becomes more and more unstable. Mm-hmm. What do you think of the possibility that if we have another crash like 2007, 2008, there will be a violent reaction against capitalism?
Well, I don't think the violent reaction is going to happen because of another crash. It will happen because there's an entire generation of young people, these millennials, who have been raised thinking that the government owes them everything. And they're the ones who are supporting Bernie Sanders, and they, together with minorities in the United States, will vote for socialism. Hispanics were used to living under socialism. They bring the same mindset here. Blacks are very happy to have something, have the government give them things as compensation for all their suffering. So, the Democratic Party will become socialist, not in the sense of nationalizing the means of production, but, of creating economic distribution of a kind that exists in Sweden, for instance. I see this as being very, very likely to happen.
Well, we have a situation where, the millennials may want all of these things, but there's the question of whether the government will be in a position to give them. And all throughout the West, we see that traditional ideas of patriotism have been hollowed out and replaced with what's called gives me dat. Now, if the government can no longer supply the gives me dat and a national crisis occur, I've long thought that they'll be bellowing away in vain because the people will say, well, if you can't give us stuff, what good are you?
Yeah, I don't know if this is going to happen in the near future. I mean, it's a possibility very, very far down the road. But we still have a lot of money in this country, and we can borrow a lot of money, and the welfare state now is much larger than it was in the past. And I have no doubt it will continue to grow under either the Democrats or the Republicans. I just don't see this as anything that's going to happen in the near term.
Do you think there's a possibility that your pessimism is conditioned by the age that you've lived through?
I really don't think, I'm not really that pessimistic. I just find the times are less and less to my liking. That I see a serious disjunction between Western bourgeois society, which still existed, however vestigially, in my youth, and what we live with now. I just have not been able to process the change fully. It is not something that I'm happy about. I mean, I think we have created problems for which I don't see solutions. What we've done is we've broken down all social codes, all moral codes, in the name of tolerance, sensitivity, other such junk ideas, and pardon my value judgment. And it's like very hard to put things back together. I mean, to reconstruct families after they've been destroyed is a very, very hard task. And it would take more than a General Franco or some kind of, authoritarian right-wing dictator to do it. I just don't know how we can find a way back to even the way things were in the 1950s in the United States.
Well, Peregrine Worsthorne, that great old British Tory,
right,
became very disillusioned, and he said, they talk of love of one's country, but in order for that to work, one's country must be lovable. Mm-hmm. And he didn't think that England was very lovable anymore.
No, it's not. It's hard.
On the other hand, I looked at what Herbert Stein famously said. There's various versions of this, as you know, that a system continues until it stops. Mm-hmm. And it seems to me that the path we're on is unsustainable. The 2007 to 2008 was a tremendous warning, which everyone ignored. Mm-hmm. And so there's no stasis in history. And I really believe that this age of wealth that we have come to expect is going to come to an end.
I see the problem as, what you're saying may be true, but I see the greater problem in ethnic racial tensions, and perhaps here I do agree with the alt-right. And also the hatred that blacks have toward whites is much greater now than when I was a kid in the 1950s. You can't even compare it. Then you have Hispanics whose racial consciousness is encouraged by our government and by our culture. And then you have all of these silly, cretinous millennials running around screaming Black Lives Matter who try to ally themselves with those trying to destroy white bourgeois civilization, what remains of a white bourgeois civilization. And I can easily see racial wars in the future, racial polarization, racial wars, and I don't think the state will be able to deal with them very effectively.
Osama bin Laden used the analogy of the strong horse and the weak horse, mm-hmm. and people look to the strong horse. And I think that a large part of our problem is that the people who are supposedly our leaders are quite deliberately weak. And if we have a change in that, then perhaps we can see a recrudescence.
Yeah, I don't think Obama has been particularly weak. I think what he has done, he has armed one side in the Civil War. The anti-bourgeois, anti-normal, anti-Christian, anti-white side. These are the ones he has catered to. They're the ones he has given influence to. At the same time, he has done nothing to improve the condition of black people in the United States. So they're much worse shape than they were before, but they're angry at the whites, and they're angry, at white racism and the police. All of this, I think, is directly attributable to Obama and his supporters, but he has not really been weak because he has strengthened He has strengthened the adversarial side in the Civil War. And
I see this leading to a Thermidorian reaction, that they are modern-day Jacobins, so they're insane, like the Jacobins of the Reign of Terror. I mean, I can think of no other word to use to describe them other than
they're much
insane.
They're much more insane than the Jacobins. I mean, the Jacobins were French nationalists. By the way, the Jacobins also opposed the declaration of war on the European monarchies. It was the the Girondistes who were responsible for that. People from the Gironde, who they're the ones who declare war. The Jacobins are against it, but the thing I don't quite understand are all these young white people, screaming death to the police, long live Freddie Gray. I mean, this is insane. Not only that Freddie Gray was a violent drug user who had been arrested about 25 times, but
he was a slip and fall artist.
Right. But, it's like anything to show their hatred, for white middle-class society.
It doesn't surprise me, though, because they're broken and empty. Yeah. So they need something to fill their lives, and the poison that they're imbibing, it gives them something to live for.
Yeah.
I'll ask you one final question. I'm a great admirer of James Burnham, particularly his book, The Machiavellians.
Right.
And I wonder what you think of the possibility of, the great critics of democracy that he cites in the book, of a shift to outright Caesarism in the West.
Yeah, I would not exclude the possibility. As some of the people on the right who are supporting Trump have this has not been an expression of humor. This has been the communication of serious communications. And they tell me, he is our Caesar. And
they call him the God Emperor. I mean, there is. It's humorous. On the other hand, there seems to be this idea of the Führerprinzip. There seems to be a lot of people embracing it.
Well, Hitler, I think, is the most extreme, disastrous example. Maybe just some leader who will see us through the crisis. Someone Carl Schmitt would have called, not a constitutional dictator, but a provisional dictator. We would not be living under a permanent dictatorship, but it would have a dictator such as the Roman dictator, or the position some wanted George Washington to assume in the United States. Somebody would just see us through the crisis. And I think as time goes on, more and more middle-class Americans, what remains of a kind of middle-class civilization, will long for such a person.
Well, on that hopeful note, we will conclude this interview. Professor Gottfried, thank you so much. It's been a delight.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.